The string player called him furniture before the king had even taken his seat. I heard it because I was the second man on the wall, 3 feet to the right of him, and the rehearsal hall at Caldwell House carries sound the way a cupped hand carries water. "Look at it," the man said to the woman beside him, tucking his instrument under his chin. "They stood a wax dummy at the door, tone-deaf furniture. It won't know a downbeat from a doorknob." She laughed the small laugh of people who think the help can't hear. The man we both guarded, Lyle Brennan, the steadiest sentry I have ever served beside, did not move a muscle in his face. But I knew him, and I knew that he had heard every word, and I knew, that night, something they did not, that Brennan had once been a man whose name those musicians would have whispered with their hats off. "I am Davies. I have stood the ceremonial posts of the king's house for 11 years, most of them beside men I would not trust to hold a door, and a few of them beside Brennan, whom I would trust with my life and did, twice. So when I tell you what happened in the Caldwell concert hall, how a roomful of the finest players in the realm spent an evening mocking the man at the door, and how that man turned out to have written the very music they bled over for their encore, I am not telling you a rumor. I was on the wall, I saw the faces change. The occasion was a state concert, the kind the house puts on perhaps twice a year, when a visiting house is to be honored, and the king wishes to show that his court can make beauty as easily as it can keep order. The orchestra had been assembled from the best of 3 cities. The conductor was a famous and impatient man named Rise, all silver hair and quick wrists, who treated the rehearsal that afternoon like a siege he intended to win by sundown. Brennan and I were posted inside the hall itself, one at each of the side doors, because protocol that night required armed sentries within the room and not merely without. We were to be still. We were to be invisible. We were, as the string player had so kindly observed, furniture. I have learned that there are 2 kinds of contempt a guard meets. The first is loud, the tourist who shouts in your face, the drunk who shoves. That kind is almost easy, because the whole room turns against the fool and you need only outlast him. The second kind is quiet, and it is worse. It is the kind that does not even bother to lower its voice, because it does not consider you a person who could be insulted. That was the contempt in the rehearsal hall that afternoon. The musicians did not bait Brennan to get a rise out of him. They simply forgot he was made of anything. "Move that one to the wall," Rise said at one point, flicking 2 fingers toward Brennan without looking at him, meaning the music stand behind him, but the players nearest snickered as if the conductor had meant the man. A cellist with a long neck and a longer sense of his own importance. Pell, I would learn his name was Pell, leaned to a colleague and said, loud enough to carry, that they ought to dust the sentries before the king arrived, in case his majesty mistook one for a coat rack. Laughter rippled along the second violins. Brennan looked at the far wall as if it contained the only interesting thing in the world. I will tell you what I was thinking, because Brennan would never tell you what he was. I was thinking that I would like very much to walk 3 feet to my right and explain to the cellist exactly what kind of furniture he was insulting. I did not, of course. We do not. But the wanting sat in me like a hot coal all afternoon, and the strange thing, the thing I could not understand yet, was that it did not seem to sit in Brennan at all. He was not enduring the mockery. He was listening to the music. I had noticed it during the first run-through, before the insult started, when the orchestra worked through the centerpiece of the program. A long, grave symphony in 3 movements that I did not know, that almost no one in the hall seemed fully to know, because Rise kept stopping them, kept saying it was not yet right, kept demanding the strings find the ache in the slow movement and stop playing it like a dance. And during all of that, Brennan, who is the most motionless man I have ever stood beside, who can hold a post for 2 hours without so much as shifting his weight, Brennan's right hand, the gloved one resting against the seam of his trousers, had moved. Just the smallest curl and release of 2 fingers. In time. Ahead of the beat, even. Once, when the conductor stopped the orchestra and barked that the entry was wrong, that the second theme came in a half bar too soon, I saw Brennan's jaw tighten, not in anger, but in something closer to recognition, the look of a man who hears his own words misquoted. I did not understand it then. I filed it away the way you file away anything odd on a long post, and I went back to standing. The afternoon wore on. The mockery wore on with it. By the time Rise called a break and the musicians scattered to the corridors for tea and complaints, the cellist Pell had appointed himself the hall's wit, and the sentries were his standing material. He came near Brennan's door on his way out, a tall cup in his hand, and stopped, and looked Brennan up and down with the frank rudeness of a man inspecting a horse he has no intention of buying. "You there?" Pell said. Brennan's eyes stayed front. "Yes, you, the statue. Tell me, does it move, or do they wind it up before the king comes in?" He glanced back at the 2 or 3 players who had drifted over to watch the fun. "Go on, say something clever, sing us a note. Surely even furniture can hum." He waited, smiling, enjoying the safety of his cruelty, the certainty that the thing at the door could not answer. Brennan did not answer. He looked through the man as if the man were a pane of glass with nothing behind it. And here is the part I have turned over 100 times since. Pell, getting no rise, decided to push harder. He lifted his cup and tilted it, not to throw it. He was not quite that stupid with the king's hall around him, but to mime the threat, to make Brennan flinch from a splash that never came. And Brennan did not flinch. But for 1/2 second, as the cup tipped, his eyes left the far wall and went to the orchestra's empty chairs, to the music still open on the stands, to the title page of the score sitting on the conductor's podium where Rise had left it. And something crossed his face that I had no name for then. I have a name for it now. It was grief. Then it was gone, and he was furniture again, and Pell, bored, wandered off to find a more responsive victim. I leaned very slightly toward Brennan's door. Against every rule of the post I murmured, "Steady." It was all I could offer. Brennan answered without moving his lips, the old barracks trick, the words barely more than breath. "I know that symphony, Davies," he said, "better than the man conducting it." And then he said nothing else for 2 hours, and I stood there with the strangest cold feeling climbing the back of my neck, because of the way he had said it, not as a boast, but as a confession, the way a man admits to a thing he has spent years trying not to be. I will tell you the little I knew about Lyle Brennan before that night, because it matters to what came after. I knew he had served, like the rest of us, his years in the line before the ceremonial posting, but where most of us came up through the ordinary regiments, Brennan had come from somewhere he never named. He had a way of standing that the drill sergeants did not teach. He read sheet music left lying around the guardroom the way other men read the racing pages, without seeming to know he was doing it. Once, 2 winters back, a young recruit had been struggling to learn a bugle call for a memorial, getting it wrong and wrong again, near tears with the shame of it before the parade. And Brennan had taken the boy aside in the dark of the equipment store and hummed the whole thing through twice, low and exact, every grace note in its place, and then said, "Now, from your chest, not your throat," and the boy had it inside 10 minutes. I had asked Brennan afterward where he'd learned music. He had looked at me a long moment and said, "A long time ago, in another life," and I had known not to ask again. So I had a guess that afternoon even before I knew, not the whole of it, but a guess. The king arrived at 7. We came to attention for him and held it while the household filed in, the visiting house in their dark colors, the court in its finery, the king himself unhurried and grave, taking his seat in the center of the front rank with the visiting prince beside him. The hall filled. The lamps came up gold along the gilded balconies, and the great chandelier threw its light down on 300 people who had come to hear beauty made, and on 2 men at the side doors whom not one of them looked at twice. The musicians, in their evening black, had transformed from the snickering crew of the afternoon into a single grave instrument of glass and rosin and breath. Rise strode out to applause, bowed, lifted his hands, and the symphony began. I am not a musical man. I want that understood, so you will believe me when I tell you that even I felt it. The first movement came on like weather, a low gathering in the cellos, Pell's cello among them, and then the whole orchestra rising into something vast and aching that filled the hall to its gilded ceiling and pressed on the chest. The king sat very still. The visiting prince leaned forward, and at his door, Brennan stood with his eyes front and his face like carved oak, and I, watching him sidelong as I was not supposed to, saw the tears stand in his eyes and not fall. They did not fall. He was too disciplined for that, and he would have died before he let one drop in front of that room. But they were there, catching the chandelier light, and his gloved hand at his trouser seam was moving again, not idly now but conducting, the smallest economy of motion, a half-inch of finger marking entrances that had not yet come and came exactly when his hand said they would. He knew this music. He knew it the way a man knows the face of someone he has loved and lost. He knew it from the inside. The slow movement was the one Rise had fought all afternoon to draw out of them, and now, before the king, the orchestra found it. It opened with a single violin line, bare and high and lonely, and then the answer came from the violas, and then the whole string section folded the melody over on itself like hands closing around a small flame. It was the saddest thing I have ever heard, and I could not have told you why. I only knew that beside me a soldier I respected above all others was standing perfectly still, while something inside him broke very quietly, and that the men who had called him furniture that afternoon were the same men now bent over their instruments wringing that grief out of horsehair and gut, and that they had no idea, none, that the sorrow they were performing had first been felt by the man at the door. Because it had, I was sure of it now. You do not weep at a stranger's music the way Brennan wept at this. You weep at your own. The movement ended. There was that held breath a great hall takes before it dares applaud, and then the applause came, and the king inclined his head and Rise bowed and bowed. The musicians beamed. Pell, the cellist, half rose to acknowledge a particular swell of approval directed at the low strings, and as he sat back down his eye traveled, idle and pleased with himself, to the side door, to Brennan, and I watched the cellist's smile curdle just slightly, because even from the stage he could see that the furniture was crying, and a man like Pell does not like to be reminded that the things he mocks can feel. He leaned to the player beside him during the pause. I could not hear it across the hall, but I did not need to. I knew the shape of the joke before he made it. What none of them knew, what I was only beginning to understand, and what the whole hall was about to learn, was that the program was not finished. After the symphony, after the formal bows, the orchestra was to play one final piece, an encore, a short, ferocious, beloved work that everyone in the realm who cared about music knew, even people like me who did not, a piece played at every great occasion, a piece that the players themselves clearly loved, because as Rise announced it and lifted his hands again, you could see them sit straighter, see Pell square his shoulders over his cello with the relish of a man about to play the thing he was born to play. And I felt Brennan, 3 feet away, go absolutely rigid, more still than still, the motionlessness of a man bracing against a blow. "What is it?" I breathed. He did not answer for a long moment. The orchestra was tuning the silence, Rise's hands raised and trembling with held energy. And then Brennan said, so low I felt it more than heard it, 3 words that turned the whole evening over in my chest like a key in a lock. I wrote that. I have replayed those 3 words more times than I can count. He did not say them with pride. He said them the way a man identifies a body, quietly, certainly, with the door of his face shut tight against what is behind it. And before I could so much as turn my head, Rise's hands came down and the encore began, and there was no more time to ask him anything, because the music took the whole hall in its fist. I will try to describe what I cannot describe. The encore was nothing like the symphony. The symphony had grieved, this thing leapt. It came roaring out of the orchestra at a pace that should not have been possible for that many hands to keep together, all fire and drive, and a melody on the high violins that climbed and would not stop climbing, and underneath it the cellos and the basses hammering out a pulse like a heart that has decided it will not be stopped. The court came alive. Heads lifted. The visiting prince had a hand pressed flat to his own chest. The king, who I had been watching for years stand and sit and incline his head with the same unhurried gravity through 100 ceremonies. The king was leaning forward, his eyes bright, his foot, I would swear it, moving against the floor. And the players loved it. That was the thing that struck me even through everything else. The men and women who had spent the afternoon being small and cruel were, in this music, large and generous and wholly given over. Pell's whole body bent into his cello as if he were rowing for shore. The famous Rise had stopped conducting like a tyrant and was conducting like a man trying to hold lightning by the tail. Whatever this piece was, it was the best of them. It pulled the best of them out and held it up to the light. It had been written by the man at the door. I looked at Brennan, I could not help it, and what I saw I will carry to my grave. He was standing at attention, eyes front, weeping openly now. The discipline that had held through the symphony finally overmatched, the tears running clean down a face that did not otherwise move at all. He made no sound. He did not raise a hand to his face. A sentry on post does not. He simply let the tears come and kept his post while his own music, the thing that had come out of him in some other life, in another life, filled the gilded hall and lifted 300 people who would never know they had him to thank. I did not understand the whole of it yet. The how and the why came later in the corridor in pieces. But standing there, I understood enough. I understood that the man Pell had told to sing us a note, the furniture he had threatened with a tipped cup, had composed the most beloved music in the realm and then walked away from it into a red tunic and a tall bearskin and 11 years of standing silent at doors. I understood that the room mocking him was, at that very moment, pouring its whole soul into proving him a genius, and did not know it. The encore drove toward its end. The melody on the violins climbed one final time, and the whole orchestra gathered itself, and Rise's hands rose up over his head, and the piece ended on a single shattering chord that hit the hall like a struck bell, and rang in the gold and the glass and the chest of every living person there. And then the hall stood up. Not politely, not in the measured ripple of a court that knows the form of these things. They came up out of their chairs in a wave, the king among them, the visiting prince among them, 300 people on their feet with their hands cracking together and their faces opened by joy, calling out, the way crowds do when something has been too good to merely sit through. Rise turned and bowed and gestured to his orchestra to rise, and the players stood, flushed and triumphant, drinking the ovation in. Pell rose with his cello and grinned the grin of a man at the summit of his life. And the whole time, at the side door, the actual author of the thing they were applauding stood unmoving, his tears drying now in the heat of the room, watching them take the bows for his work, and asked nothing and claimed nothing, and was, to every eye in that hall but mine, a coat rack with a rifle. I want to be honest about what I felt because it was not noble. I felt a fury rise in me that I have rarely felt on any post. 11 years I have swallowed the contempt of the thoughtless, and I have learned to let it pass over me like water. But this was not contempt for me. This was the whole court, and the conductor, and that smirking cellist, standing in a storm of glory that belonged to the silent man at the door, and not one of them turning their head an inch to see him. I wanted to break my post. I wanted to walk out into the middle of that hall and say, you fools, you are clapping for him, turn around, he is right there. I did not, but God forgive me, I wanted to. It was Brennan who steadied me without a word the way he always had. As the ovation crested, he turned his head a quarter-inch, the most motion I had seen from him all night, and met my eye for the briefest moment, and there was no fury in his face. There was something I can only call peace. It said, plainly as speech, let them have it. It is enough that they love it. It does not have to be mine for it to be true. That was Brennan. That would have been the whole story, the silent composer, content to be furniture, carrying his secret out the door at midnight, if not for the conductor's pride and a single sheet of paper, and the fact that the visiting prince had a memory and a question. because as the ovation finally began to ebb and the king raised a hand to settle the hall, the visiting prince did not sit. He stepped forward instead, to the edge of the front rank, and addressed Rise across the floor in a voice trained to carry, the voice of a man accustomed to having a hall fall quiet for him. He thanked the conductor. He praised the orchestra. And then he said the thing that turned the key the rest of the way. "That final work," the prince said, "I have loved it since I was a boy. We play it in my own house on our gravest days, and I have always wondered, and tonight of all nights in this hall I find I must ask who wrote it. The histories I have read give a name and then a silence. They say the composer laid down his pen at the height of it and was never heard from again. Conductor, do you know? Did the man simply vanish from the earth?" And Rise, the famous Rise, who had drilled the orchestra all afternoon and conducted like a god all evening, opened his mouth to answer the prince of a visiting house in the king's own hall, and had nothing. He did not know. The greatest conductor in 3 cities did not know who had written the piece he had just made 300 people weep over. The hall waited, the prince waited. And from the side door, in the silence, a voice that I had heard speak perhaps 50 sentences in 3 years said, quietly and clearly, without leaving its post, "He did not vanish, Your Highness. He took a different oath. I have stood in some quiet rooms. The held breath before a coffin is lowered. The pause when an officer reads out a name and the family does not move. I have never heard a hall go as quiet as Caldwell House when in the second after the furniture spoke. 300 heads turned toward the side door at once. The king turned. The prince turned. Rise on the podium turned with his baton still half raised, his face the face of a man who has heard a statue clear its throat. And Pell, I watched Pell. I made sure to watch Pell. Pell turned with his cello still against his shoulder and his triumphant grin still half on his mouth. And the grin came apart slowly as he understood that the room was not looking at him anymore, that the room was looking past him, at the door, at the man he had told to sing them a note. Brennan did not move from his post. That is the thing you must understand. The whole hall had turned to him, and a prince had been answered by him, and he stood exactly as he had stood all night, eyes front now meeting the prince's eyes, rifle at his side, the gold light running along the brass of his buttons. He had not stepped forward to claim anything. He had simply, when a true thing was asked in his hearing, declined to let a lie stand in its place. "Guardsmen," it was the king who spoke. His voice was not loud, but it filled the room the way only that voice could. "You will explain that remark. And here a guard is caught, you understand, between 2 duties, the duty to keep silent at his post, and the duty to answer his king truthfully when commanded. There is no protocol for the second outranking the first, because it is not supposed to come up." Brennan stood another half-second, deciding, and then he did the only thing a man of his discipline could do. He came to full attention, the crack of his heels loud in the silence, and he addressed his king without crossing the floor, his voice carrying clean to the front rank. "Your Majesty, the work was written by a man who was, in another life, a musician. He laid down the pen because the things he loved most were 2, the music and the house. He could serve only one with his whole life. He chose the house. He asked that his name come off the work so that the work would belong to everyone and the man would belong to his post. He has kept that bargain for 11 years, and he asks the indulgence of keeping it now. The piece is the realms. The composer is no one Your Majesty need trouble with. He is only a sentry doing his duty, and badly, for speaking out of turn." You could have heard a glove drop. The prince's hand had risen to his mouth. Rise had lowered his baton entirely and was staring at the door with an expression I can only call hunger. The hunger of a man of music who has spent an afternoon insulting, and an evening conducting, the work of the very person he could not be bothered to look at. But it was the king who broke the silence, and he broke it gently. "A man may keep a bargain," the king said, "and still be thanked for it. Come here, guardsmen." Brennan hesitated. To leave a post under orders is permitted. To leave it to be honored is, to a man like Brennan, very nearly worse than the mockery had been. But the king had spoken, and so he handed his rifle off to me, placed it in my hands with the same care he handed me everything, and met my eye, and I saw that the peace was gone now and the fear had come, the plain human fear of a private man dragged into the center of a lit room, and then he marched down the aisle between the rows of the court, in his red tunic and his tall bearskin, the most disciplined walk I have ever seen a man make, every step a small war against the urge to bolt for the door instead. He came to a halt before the king and the prince and the silver-haired conductor and the whole risen orchestra, and he saluted, and he waited to be told what was to become of him. Rise could not contain himself. The conductor stepped down off his podium around his own first violins and stood before Brennan with his hands actually shaking. I have conducted that piece 40 times, Rise said, and his famous voice cracked on it. 40 times in 5 countries. I have argued with scholars about what you meant in the second movement, about the half-bar before the second theme, whether it was an error in the copy or a deliberate hurt. He searched Brennan's face. Which was it? I have to know. Was it an error? And Brennan, Lyle Brennan, the furniture, the coat rack, the thing that did not know a downbeat from a doorknob, looked at the greatest conductor in 3 cities and answered him in the language Rise had given his life to. It was deliberate, Brennan said. The theme comes in early because grief does. It does not wait for the bar line. It arrives before you are ready for it every time. Your strings played it correctly tonight for the first time I have heard. You found the ache. I had nearly given up hoping anyone would. I watched Rise's eyes fill. I watched a man at the top of his art receive from a sentry at a door the one piece of understanding he had spent his life chasing. And I watched, beyond him, the orchestra, the whole black-clad orchestra that had snickered all afternoon begin, one by one, to understand what they had done and who they had done it to. It started with the second violins, the ones who had laughed loudest at the cellist's joke about dusting the sentries. One of them, a young woman, set her instrument down across her knees and put her hand over her mouth. The man beside her went white. The understanding moved through the orchestra the way fire moves through dry grass, soft and total. They had mocked him, called him furniture, told him to hum them a note, and he had stood there and let them. And then he had wept at the beauty they wrung out of his own grief. And then he had handed the conductor the secret of the second movement as though it were nothing, as though he had not been the loneliest man in the room all night. And Pell, the cellist Pell who had started all of it, he had not moved. He sat in the low strings with his cello slack against him and his face the color of ash, and I saw on it the particular sickness of a cruel man who has just learned exactly how small his cruelty was, and against exactly how large a soul he had aimed it. He did not speak. There was nothing he could say. He had told a great composer to sing him a note, and the composer had instead made 300 people rise to their feet, and had asked for nothing in return but to be left at his door in peace. The king let the silence hold. Then he rose from his seat, and the whole hall, which had only just sat, rose with him. I have stood many ovations in this hall, the king said. I have given a few. I have never before been moved to give one to a man at a door. He looked at Brennan, and something passed between them that I think only 2 men who have each given their whole lives to duty could fully share. You chose my house over your own name, guardsman. I will not undo that choice tonight. A man's bargain is his own. But the realm will not have its composer go on being called furniture. So here is what we will do. The king turned to Rise. Conductor, your orchestra will play that piece once more, and this time the program will be corrected. He looked back at Brennan. Not with your name, since you have asked otherwise, but with the truth. Before you raise your hands, conductor, you will tell this hall that the man who wrote what they are about to hear stood at that door all evening, and heard everything that was said in front of him and bore it, and that he is a soldier of this house. That is not your name, guardsman. That is your honor, and your honor I will not let you give away. I have served the king for 11 years, and I have never loved him as I did in that moment. Brennan's discipline failed him exactly once. His chin dropped half an inch, no more, and he looked at the floor of the hall as if the polished wood had become very interesting, and when he raised his head again his jaw was set against the thing rising in him. "Your Majesty is generous," he managed. "More than the work deserves." "The work," said the visiting prince quietly, "is the finest I know, and I have just learned that the man who made it has guarded the same door for 11 years and never once told a soul. Guardsmen, in my house, we have a word for a man who can make a thing that beautiful and then choose to stand silent beside it for the rest of his life. We do not call him furniture." He paused. "We call him the only kind of man worth honoring at all." I saw Pell in the low strings lower his eyes. I will not pretend I felt sorry for him, but I will say that the public unmaking of the cellist's cruelty was not loud, and it was not cruel in return, and it was all the more complete for that. No one named him. No one had to. He sat in that hall while a prince and a king honored the man he had mocked, and he understood, better than any speech could have made him understand, the exact size of what he had done, and the exact size of the man he had done it to. That is the only justice the niche of pride ever needs. You do not have to punish the small man. You have only to set him beside the great one in the full light and let him measure himself. Rise returned to his podium. He did not pick up his baton at once. He stood and looked out over the hall, and then at the side door where Brennan had come from, empty now, and he did the thing the king had asked, and he did it well because Rise, for all his pride, was at bottom a man who loved music more than he loved himself. "My lords, your majesty, your highness." His voice had steadied, but only just. "All my life I have conducted the work of dead men. I learned this morning that I would conduct the greatest of them tonight, and I believed, as the histories told me, that he had laid down his pen and gone into the dark, and that I would never know what he meant by a single bar of it." He turned and looked directly at Brennan, who had been brought to stand at the edge of the front rank, beside the king, in a place no sentry of the house had ever stood. "I was wrong. He did not go into the dark. He went to a door in this very hall and he stood there, and tonight I conducted his music while he watched, and I did not know it, and the famous voice broke at last and Rise let it. I called him a wax dummy this afternoon, to his face. And he forgave me by telling me how to play his slow movement. We will play the encore again, and we will play it for him." He raised his hands. "I cannot tell you it was better than the first time, because I am not a musical man and the first time had already broken me. But I can tell you that something had changed in the orchestra, and that even I could hear it. They were not playing for the king now, or for the ovation, or for themselves. They were playing for the man standing at the king's side in the red tunic, the man who had heard them mock him and had answered with grace, and they poured into it a kind of apology that no words could have carried. The young woman in the second violins played with tears on her face. Rise conducted with his whole body, every gesture an act of contrition. And Pell played the best I heard him play all night, bent over his cello, giving the bass line everything he had, because it was the only language he had left to say what he could not say with his mouth. And Brennan stood and listened to his own grief made beautiful by the people who had scorned him, and this time the tears did fall, and no one in that hall thought less of him for it. 300 people watched a soldier weep at a door he no longer stood at, and understood that they were watching something rare, a man being given back, for the length of one piece of music, the life he had chosen to set down. When it ended, the hall rose again, and this time it turned to face the door he had guarded, and the man beside the king, and it gave him the ovation it had given the orchestra, and the king let it run long. Brennan stood at attention through all of it, eyes front, and took it the way he had taken the mockery, without moving, without claiming, a man enduring honor with the same iron with which he had endured contempt. The only difference, and it was the whole difference, was that this time the room had turned around. This time they saw him. He came back to my door when it was over. The court was flowing out into the gold-lit corridors. The prince had clasped his hand. Rise had tried 3 times to make him promise to write again, and Brennan had only said, "I will think on it," which from Brennan was a great deal. He came back to where I stood holding his rifle, and he took it from me with that same care, and he settled it at his side, and he resumed his post as though the last hour had not happened. For a while neither of us spoke. The lamps were being put out one by one along the balconies. Somewhere a long way off the orchestra was packing its instruments and going home, and I thought of Pell carrying his cello out into the night, a smaller man than he had carried it in, and I did not mind. "You could have told them at the start," I said finally. "Lo, the old barracks trick. You could have saved yourself the whole afternoon." Brennan was quiet a moment. "If I had told them at the start," he said, "they would have played it for the composer. Tonight they played it for the music all afternoon, not knowing. That was truer." A pause. "And then at the end they played it for the man. A musician gets one of those in his life if he is lucky, Davies. I got both in one evening standing at a door. I am not owed more than that." I have turned that over for a long time. I think he meant it. I think Lyle Brennan would have died furniture content if a prince had not asked the right question. And I think the reason the realm should be glad he did not is the same reason the king would not let him give his honor away. A man who can make a thing that beautiful and then guard a door in silence for 11 years, asking nothing, taking the mockery of small men without breaking. That man is not hiding from greatness. He is the greatest thing in the room, and the only one in it who does not need you to know. We stood the rest of the watch in silence, the way we always had. The hall went dark around us. And when the relief came at last to take the post, Brennan handed off as he always did, perfectly, exactly, every word of the handover in its place, and walked out into the cold air a sentry, and nothing more, and everything more, and asked the night for nothing at all. I never heard him call himself a composer, not once in the years that followed, but I noticed that the young recruits, when they could not find a tune, still went to him in the dark of the equipment store, and I noticed that he never once turned them away. That, I think, was the only audience Lyle Brennan ever really wanted, one frightened boy who needed the note, and a steady man in the dark willing to hum it true.